Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of Disparate Post Ireland. I am your host, Frank Lennon, coming to you from the fair city of Dublin. War is not a necessary evil. It can be stopped. Peace and dialogue have never hurt Mother Earth. Or it is better than to have bodies necessarily chopped, that to a new happy world we give a grand new birth. From his poem, The Futility of War, by Ronnie Patra. In recent weeks, images of the Manchester bombing incident flashed across our TV screens, and from old and new media alike, reports of associated deaths and injury cascaded once again within our midst. It was déjà vu. My psyche battled to sustain balance. "Get a grip, man," my inner voice commanded. "This happened in Manchester. You are hundreds of miles away." For those of us who are capable of feeling empathy, with every such incident, the battle for balance becomes ever more challenging. We feel the suffering of our brothers and sisters, no matter the distance. Whether it is a child bombed to smithereens in Syria, a Palestinian gunned down in the West Bank, or a person blown to bits while walking along a street in Manchester, it makes absolutely no difference. Emotional pain is emotional pain. In the hours immediately following the Manchester bombings, I found my thoughts regularly turning to those whose lives had been suddenly and irrevocably and violently changed by that psychopathic, murderous act. So many thoughts and questions flooded my mind. They seemed to coalesce into a type of reasoning, an attempt at understanding the why and the how of Manchester. A visceral urge compelled me to write my thoughts down. Perhaps it was a craving for catharsis. While our brothers, sisters and children around the world are suffering amidst the myriad of mindless, greed-fueled conflicts, those of us who currently lead lives of relative peace can no longer afford the luxury of being a silent majority. We must lend our voices, loudly and clearly, to the oppressed and the voiceless. We must call out evil where we see it, whether perpetrated by state or by individual. We must demand a better world of our public representatives, a world for the many, not just the privileged few. These, then, were my thoughts on Manchester, which I later published. Manchester, England, 22nd of May 2017, 22:30 hours, and a bomb, apparently an IED, is detonated outside the Manchester Arena, just as an Ariana Grande concert is ending. The explosion, we are told, was a suicide bomb that killed 22 and injured many more. Firstly, normal human beings will feel a profound sense of empathy towards all of those who may have been deeply affected in any way by such an atrocious act. Normal human beings will also feel a massive sense of revulsion towards all perpetrators, organisers and funders of what could only be described as utterly psychopathic, evil and depraved behaviour, which is the essence of each and every one of these coldly and carefully organised atrocities. Deeply disturbing and callous events of this nature seem to be unfolding globally almost on a daily basis now, as we journey through our epoch of near universal deceit. Such wanton evil spawns a palatable sense of decline of general well-being within our human family. Since that mass murderous act perpetrated at the World Trade Center in New York on the 11th of September 2001, our world human family well-being quotient has been experiencing the same level of free fall experienced by the fragments of the pulverized structures of those formerly iconic buildings as their residue cascaded to the ground. Also, smothered within that blinding and choking massive grey fog as it billowed out of those collapsing structures were the incinerated fragments of loved ones, many thousands of them. To date, not a single individual has been brought to justice for that shocking mass massacre. No criminal investigation was subsequently opened into the events which surrounded 9/11, and more suspiciously, each and every family of those who either lost their lives or suffered injury on that day of infamy have since been financially compensated and their issues settled out of court. Think about that. Each and every family. 9/11 was not just an American event, it was a global event. That is, an event which to this day continues to have a profound negative impact throughout our entire world. As a global human family, we felt utterly traumatized, which of course was the clear intent of the criminal organizers of 9/11. With no subsequent criminal investigation leading to probable arrests and probable murder convictions, the entire world was left to carry the deeply affecting emotional burden of that horrific event. Worse still, 9/11 was then taken and used as a cynical justification to subsequently invade several sovereign Middle Eastern nations, and the additional slaughter of hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children ensued. We now return to Manchester 2017, which is apparently the latest iteration in the global terrorization of nations. We must be compelled to ask the valid question: who is truly behind all of this apparent strategically timed and strategically placed world mayhem? Well, it clearly benefits some, because an inordinate amount of time and money is obviously being pumped into making it happen. There is one thing for sure, which is as applicable to the Manchester incident as it is to any other comparable terror incident to date. There are multiple layers of both players and actions involved. At least the following would have to happen as part of every terror action: planning, training, supports, finance, logistics, armament, propaganda, a beneficiary or beneficiaries, extreme ideology, and psychopathy. Someone somewhere benefits from each individual terror action. However, the cumulative effect of multiple such actions over time may mold a population into a frame of mind to seek and accept greater and greater so-called protections from their so-called state establishments. Such so-called protections never come with additional human rights or freedoms. Quite the contrary. In such circumstance, states gain ever greater control over their populations. We are, of course, familiar with the term police state. This, unfortunately, becomes the inevitable outcome. Interesting to note in recent years is the swing to the right in various countries around the globe. My sense of it is that this is happening among establishments because of the growing awareness among populations of the outright exploitative nature of neoliberal capitalism, which has been shown to have gutted middle and working class incomes and security over recent decades. There is likely great panic within the ranks of the global capitalist club, as their number probably visualize masses of the great unwashed looming on the horizon and heading their way, wielding pitchforks. In summary, race to the bottom, still being aggressively pursued within the private sector, has been a significant success for the 1%. For me, however, this significant shift to the right has been totally counterintuitive. Given the abject failure of neoliberal capitalism to sustain the middle and working class, one would have thought that perhaps such may begin to push political leanings among general populations more towards the left. While a movement to the left did begin to occur in some European countries, like, for example, Greece and Spain, the surge was not of sufficient strength to produce any sustained, viable pushback against far-right and centre-right establishments and their very best friends, i.e. banksters and mega corporations. In Tory Britain, we now have Brexit. The Brexit situation was brought about through a combination of disgruntled far-right elements like the nationalist Farage factor, whose supporters had a pathological dislike anyway of the corporate European empire from its very outset. In addition, Brexit was fuelled by a left-leaning segment of the British population who had seen the devastation of Britain's industrial base and jobs, which had been brought about by open market sell-offs of whole swathes of British manufacturing industry. The Tory party called a snap general election, which they set for the 8th of June 2017. This was done against the backdrop of a recent general election in France, in which the right-wing globalist and Goldman Sachs conformist Emmanuel Macron was declared the victor, globalist being the important takeaway here. In recent days it appears that Tory leader Theresa may have had a bad hair experience at the hustings. She was forced into a U-turn on a hugely unpopular issue of Tory policy related to the elderly. Her political opponent, Jeremy Corbyn, in contrast, seemed to be making significant advances with increasing popular support. So along comes the Manchester incident, just 17 days before Britain's people head to the polls. Coincidence? Maybe. Maybe not. Who can say? Great opportunity, though, for the Tories. In the least of situations, it provided a massive distraction. In the best of situations, it could be a golden opportunity for Theresa May to flex her security and military muscle and work it for the beneficial psychological impact on voters at large. Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, is on record as stating that 9/11 was good for Israel. Why might that be? Well, it was used as a justification for the invasion of Iraq. That invasion, in turn, led to a sustained US military presence in a significant swathe of the Middle East, a swathe which, coincidentally, Israel just happened to desire carved up. Earlier this morning, 23rd of May 2017, the day immediately following the Manchester incident, I was listening to a local radio station called News Talk and an early morning programme hosted by broadcaster Pat Kenny. Kenny turned to a piece which purported to be about the Manchester bombing and proceeded to introduce and interview a British individual whose surname was given as White. What was striking to me about this interview was very little time was spent discussing the grief, death and injury experienced by whatever innocent individuals who had found themselves inadvertently caught up in that atrocity. However, a very significant amount of time was spent discussing political matters, that is, what sort of impact the event would likely have in relation to Theresa May's position in the polls. Mr. White intensely talked up the Tories while losing no opportunity to talk down Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. Was Manchester being used for a political purpose previously intended? Who knows? It was like the radio equivalent of clickbait. Its introduction led one to believe that information was going to be imparted about the Manchester atrocity. However, Manchester was actually capitalised upon as a virtual party political broadcast for the Tory party. Ah yes, wheels within wheels, and more layers to such events than one might find among the skins of an onion. Now, I'm sure no direct link will ever be found between the individual who committed the Manchester suicide, multiple murders, and the British general election. I'm sure also that there may not have been any connection to the British general election within the mind of the individual before he pressed the fateful button. However, if one was actually in a position to travel back through those layers, I strongly suspect that some connection, however tenuous, might well be found. The scale and reach of today's world terrorization program, and it is a program, requires very significant resources of many kinds. Part of the resources needed would be a steady supply of impressionable young individuals who after indoctrination into extremism are then continually brainwashed into believing that they have a vital role to play in perpetuating the twisted ideology, which their cult and or likely occult handlers have successfully imprinted deep within their vulnerable psyche. Media reports indicate that the individual responsible for the Manchester incident was a Mancunian, but with Libyan ancestry. Like the Japanese kamikaze pilots of World War II, aspiring martyrs will wait willingly and patiently for their opportunity to do their deity's will. As sleepers, they will await the trigger word or phrase from their handlers. Such handlers may be way down deep within the layers of evil which typically surround the manipulation and use of martyrs for such mass murder. Press reports indicated that ISIS had claimed responsibility for the Manchester incident. Surprise? No, no surprise at all. It is commonly understood that ISIS was spawned from Al-Qaeda, and that the latter was the creation of the CIA. There is, of course, a close symbiotic relationship between the CIA and NSA in the US and MI5 and MI6 in Britain. One could say they're joined at the hip. So, we move back into British politics now for a bit. Would the powers that shouldn't be in world finance be happy to see a Labour Party, led by someone of integrity like Jeremy Corbyn, who is correctly described as a true socialist, ascend to the leadership and government in Britain? I don't think so. Would the likes of Jeremy Corbyn be a willing globalist and be happy to take Britain into a world army or into a world police force? I may be wrong in this, but I very much doubt it. So, to the fanatical financial globalist elites who seem to have a chokehold on the world economy of today, Jeremy Corbyn would likely be anathema. What then could be done to distract the minds of the voting public from election issues unfavourable to the incumbent administration? What could be done to up the ante in terms of fear amidst the general public? What could be done to give the establishment's candidate of choice, Theresa May, an opportunity to apparently show strong leadership in matters of security and, by extension, reinforce a narrative of weakness on the opposing political side? Well, what if the martyrs were to be called into action? What if an opportunity could be set up for one or more of their kind to practice their ultimate action of psychopathic insanity amidst an unsuspecting public? Remember 9/11 and how well that subsequently went for an evil cohort of murderers who desired the introduction of draconian laws, further restricting human rights, and the facilitation of a world-reach violence agenda, never-ending war. I'm not saying that the above is what happened with Manchester, but I would not in the least be surprised if either some or all of that was actually what happened. Manchester may have been another psychological means to a population persuading end. There are evil individuals among us who are well capable of organising such cold and callous actions in furtherance of their own financial or political ends. History has shown us this on numerous past occasions. Whether we care to acknowledge it or not, we are dealing with one inescapable fact. Real evil is currently at large in our world. 9/11 was the Pandora's box which released that evil. It's been all downhill for our world family well-being since then, until 9/11 is comprehensively, independently and criminally investigated, and those evil shadow players who orchestrated and executed it are finally brought to justice. The open wound which it has caused on the collective flesh of our human family will continue to fester and take many more innocent lives down as it rots its way through our psyche. Consider this. Media are now reporting that the individual who carried out the Manchester bombing had recently travelled to Libya. and was not long returned to Britain. Apparently, he was known to security services, but was not being monitored. How incredible is that? Not alone that, but apparently either concerned members of the individual's family or some friends had already tipped off the authorities on a number of occasions concerning what they observed as certain radicalist activities and or pronouncements attributable to the bomber. In the face of the above, one could be forgiven for thinking that the bomber was not to be disturbed in his mission. Who planned, trained, supported and financed the bomber? Hang on, didn't the media also confirm that he had been trained by ISIS? Would that be the same ISIS which was spawned by Al-Qaeda? Would it be the same Al-Qaeda which was spawned by the CIA? Would that be the same CIA which is joined at the hip to Britain's MI5, MI6? Oh dear, what do we seem to have here? So, after all of that, if you still don't think it could be possible, well, let me introduce you to the following. Project MK Ultra, the Tavistock Institute, Edward Bernays, and who exactly is ISIS? I will leave you to do your own research in relation to those areas. I will also leave you with these parting few thoughts on the subject. In this age of deception, nothing in life may be as it seems. We need to keep our eyes and ears wide open and to question everything. We need to be politically engaged, active citizens. We need to continuously and vigorously defend our human rights, democratic rights, and in particular, our freedom of speech. We need to closely monitor the utterances and indeed actions of our so-called political elites. In the days following the Manchester bombing, and following publication of my own thoughts on that horrific incident, I happened upon a link on Twitter to an article published on the net site Counterpunch, penned by the investigative journalist John Pilger. As many may know, John Pilger is a world-renowned journalist. He is a prolific writer and filmmaker in the genre of geopolitics. John's work is underpinned by excellent research, and his narrative is typically a no-holds-barred exposé of reality. As I read John's article, I felt vindicated in the mosaic of thoughts which had coalesced in my mind following Manchester. It was almost as if John had taken my broad brushstrokes and systematically peeled through the many layers to reveal so many uncomfortable and deadly subterranean truths. These, then, are John Pilger's thoughts on Manchester. The unsayable in Britain's general election campaign is this: the causes of the Manchester Atrocity, in which 22 mostly young people were murdered by a jihadist, are being suppressed to protect the secrets of British foreign policy. Critical questions, such as why the security service MI5 maintained terrorist assets in Manchester, and why the government did not warn the public of the threat in their midst, remain unanswered, deflected by the promise of an internal review. The alleged suicide bomber Salman Abedi was part of an extremist group, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, that thrived in Manchester and was cultivated and used by MI5 for more than 20 years. The LIFG is prescribed by Britain as a terrorist organisation which seeks a hardline Islamic State in Libya and is part of a wider global Islamic extremist movement, as inspired by Al-Qaeda. The smoking gun is that Theresa May was Home Secretary. LIFG jihadists were allowed to travel unhindered across Europe and encouraged to engage in battle, first to remove Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, then to join Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups in Syria. Last year, the FBI reportedly placed al-Baidi on a terrorist watch list and warned MI5 that his group was looking for a political target in Britain. Why wasn't he apprehended and the network around him prevented from planning and executing the atrocity on the 22nd of May? These questions arise because of an FBI leak that demolished the lone wolf spin in the wake of the 22nd of May attack. Thus, the panicky, uncharacteristic outrage directed at Washington from London and Donald Trump's apology. The Manchester Atrocity lifts the rock of British foreign policy to reveal its Faustian alliance with extreme Islam, especially the sect known as Wahhabism or Salafism, whose principal, custodian and banker is the oil kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Britain's biggest weapons customer. This imperial marriage reaches back to the Second World War and the early days of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. The aim of British policy was to stop pan-Arabism, Arab states developing a modern secularism, asserting their independence from the imperialist West and controlling their own resources. The creation of a rapacious Israel was meant to expedite this. Pan-Arabism has since been crushed. The goal now is division and conquest. In 2011, according to the Middle East Eye, the LIFG in Manchester were known as the Manchester Boys. Implacably opposed to Muammar Gaddafi, they were considered high risk, and a number were under Home Office control orders, house arrest. When anti-Gaddafi demonstrations broke out in Libya, a country forged from myriad tribal enmities. Suddenly, the control orders were lifted. I was allowed to go, no questions asked, said one LAFG member. MI5 returned their passports, and counter-terrorism police at Heathrow Airport were told to let them board their flights. The overthrow of Gaddafi, who controlled Africa's largest oil reserves, had been long planned in Washington and London. According to French intelligence, the LIFG made several assassination attempts on Gaddafi in the 1990s, bankrolled by British intelligence. In March 2011, France, Britain, and the US seized the opportunity of humanitarian intervention and attacked Libya. They were joined by NATO, under cover of a UN resolution to protect civilians. Last September, a House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee inquiry concluded that the then Prime Minister David Cameron had taken the country to war against Gaddafi on a series of erroneous assumptions, and that the attack had led to the rise of Islamic State in North Africa. The Commons Committee quoted what it called Barack Obama's pithy description of Cameron's role in Libya as a shit show. In fact, Obama was a leading actor in the shit show, urged on by his warmongering Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and a media accusing Gaddafi of planning genocide against his own people. We knew that if we waited one more day, says Obama, Benghazi, a city the size of Charlotte, could suffer a massacre that would have reverberated across the region and stained the conscience of the world. The massacre story was fabricated by Salafist militias, facing defeat by Libyan government forces. They told Reuters there would be a real bloodbath, a massacre like we saw in Rwanda. The Commons Committee reported. The proposition that Muammar Gaddafi would have ordered the massacre of civilians in Benghazi was not supported by the available evidence. Britain, France and the United States effectively destroyed Libya as a modern state. According to its own records, NATO launched 9,700 strike sorties, of which more than a third hit civilian targets. They included fragmentation bombs and missiles with uranium warheads. The cities of Misrata and Sirte were carpet-bombed. UNICEF, the UN's children's organization, reported a high proportion of the children killed were under the age of 10. More than giving rise to Islamic State, ISIS had already taken root in the ruins of Iraq following the Blair and Bush invasion of 2003. These ultimate medievalists now had all of North Africa as a base. The attack also triggered a stampede of refugees fleeing to Europe. Cameron was celebrated in Tripoli as a liberator, or imagined he was. The crowds cheering him included those secretly supplied and trained by Britain's SAS and inspired by Islamic State, such as the Manchester Boys. To the Americans and British, Gaddafi's true crime was his iconoclastic independence and his plan to abandon the petrodollar, a pillar of American imperial power. He had audaciously planned to underwrite a common African currency backed by gold, establish an all-African bank, and promote economic union among poor countries with prized resources. Whether or not this would have happened, the very notion was intolerable to the US, as it prepared to enter Africa and bribe African governments with military partnerships. The fallen dictator fled for his life. A Royal Air Force plane spotted his convoy, and in the rubble of Sirte he was sodomized with a knife by a fanatic described in the news as a rebel. Having plundered Libya's 30 billion arsenal, the rebels advanced south, terrorizing towns and villages. Crossing into sub-Saharan Mali, they destroyed the country's fragile stability. The ever-eager French sent planes and troops to their former colony to fight Al-Qaeda, or the menace they had helped to create. On the 14th of October 2011, President Obama announced he was sending Special Forces troops to Uganda to join the civil war there. In the next few months, US combat troops were sent to South Sudan, Congo, and the Central African Republic. With Libya secured, an American invasion of the African continent was underway, largely unreported. In London, one of the world's biggest arms fairs was staged by the British government. The buzz in the stands was the demonstration effect in Libya. The London Chamber of Commerce and Industry held a preview entitled Middle East, a vast market for UK defence and security companies. The host was the Royal Bank of Scotland, a major investor in cluster bombs, which were used extensively against civilian targets in Libya. The blurb for the bank's arms party lauded the unprecedented opportunities for UK defence and security companies. Last month, Prime Minister Theresa May was in Saudi Arabia, selling more than £3 billion worth of British arms, which the Saudis have used against Yemen. Based in control rooms in Riyadh, British military advisors assist the Saudi bombing raids, which have killed more than 10,000 civilians. There are now clear signs of famine. A Yemeni child dies every 10 minutes from preventable disease, says UNICEF. The Manchester Atrocity on the 22nd of May was the product of such unrelenting state violence in faraway places, much of it British-sponsored. The lives and names of the victims are almost never known to us. This truth struggles to be heard, just as it struggled to be heard when the London Underground was bombed on the 7th of July 2005. Occasionally, a member of the public would break the silence. such as the East Londoner who walked in front of a CNN camera crew and reporter in mid-platitude. "Iraq," he said. "We invaded Iraq. What did we expect?" "Go on. Say it." At a large media gathering I attended, many of the important guests uttered Iraq and Blair as a kind of catharsis for that which they dared not say professionally and publicly. Yet, before he invaded Iraq, Blair was warned by the Joint Intelligence Committee that the threat from Al-Qaeda will increase at the onset of any military action against Iraq. The worldwide threat from other Islamist terrorist groups and individuals will increase significantly. Just as Blair brought home to Britain the violence of his and George W. Bush's blood-soaked shit show, so David Cameron, supported by Theresa May, compounded his crime in Libya and its horrific aftermath, including those killed and maimed in the Manchester Arena on the 22nd of May. The spin is back, not surprisingly. Salman Abedi acted alone. He was a petty criminal, no more. The extensive network revealed last week by the American leak has vanished, but the questions have not. Why was Abedi able to travel freely through Europe to Libya and back to Manchester only days before he committed his terrible crime? Was Theresa May told by MI5 that the FBI had tracked him as part of an Islamic cell planning to attack a political target in Britain? In the current election campaign, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has made a guarded reference to a war on terror that has failed. As he knows, it was never a war on terror, but a war of conquest and subjugation. Palestine, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. Iran is said to be next, before there is another Manchester. Who will have the courage to say that? In recent days, WikiLeaks posed the following question in a Twitter poll. Could there be a link between Labour's, i.e. Jeremy Corbyn's promise to crack down on Saudi, and the pre-election surge in attacks? The 4 response options provided were: 1. No. 2. ISIS protecting Saudi. 3. Saudi nudging ISIS. And 4. Other. With 8 hours left before the poll was set to close, 22,929 people had responded. 46% of people had declared a belief that the surge in attacks was likely caused by Saudi nudging ISIS. To help us more easily conceptualize today's vicious cycle of endless war, we must thank James Melville, who, via Twitter, recently provided this starkly revealing graphic. Given that there is no obvious and appropriate start point within the illustrated cycle, we will consider its stages from the dark blue arrow at the top as follows. Stage 1. Allies react to extremism by bombing Middle Eastern targets. Stage 2. Middle Eastern targets are destroyed and civilians die. Stage 3. The behaviour of the Allies angers the people whose lives have been destroyed. Stage 4. Some of those angry people are radicalised by extremist groups. Stage 5. Allied-based manufacturers supply weapons to extremists. Stage 6. Extremists use Allied-supplied weapons to attack Western targets. And the cycle restarts. James has named the process the cycle of international stupidity. I would go one further and rename the process as the cycle of international greed and stupidity. As this video presentation draws towards a close, I'm reminded of some of the lyrics of a song penned by the late, great Pete Seeger and delivered so masterfully by the group Peter, Paul and Mary. The title of the song is "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" The salient question asked is, oh, when will they ever learn? When indeed? Samuel Smiles reassures us that hope is like the sun, which, as we journey towards it, casts the shadow of our burden behind us. In these, the most difficult of times for our human family, we must keep the flame of hope burning and believe that it will guide us into the light of a new dawn, a new day. When I despair, I remember that all throughout history, the way of truth and love has always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they seem invincible. But in the end, they always fail. Think of it. Always. Mahatma Gandhi.